Hamas is more the Viet Cong than ISIS. The history of colonialism in Vietnam and the American defeat by the Viet Cong can explain what's happening in Palestine and shed light on Hamas's strategy. Let us go back in history. Since the 1800s, Vietnam was colonized by the French, the Japanese, and then the French again. They fought off each colonial and imperial power by relying on the strategy of guerrilla warfare to defeat more powerful adversaries. Their goal was to establish an independent and democratic Vietnam. The North went to the communist Viet Minh revolutionaries that defeated the French, and the South to a Western-backed regime. While reunification through elections was part of the agreement, the Americans made sure it never happened, so the South became essential for American regional interests. But the Vietnamese opposed partition and wanted to liberate and unite their entire country. This was their foundation for war against the South in the US, what they regarded as a just war. This is where the Viet Cong come in. Also known as the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, they were based in the South and fought the regime from within. Unlike previous Vietnamese revolutionaries, they relied on a guerrilla strategy. Guerrilla warfare is usually when there's an asymmetry of power between one side and the other, often fought between insurgents and a conventional army. And the conventional army loses if it does not win, and the guerrilla wins if he does not lose. In this type of warfare, the main objective of the guerrilla is to survive protracted fighting with the adversary.
Leave wreckage, suffering, and death in the wake of coordinated sneak attacks on 3 U.S. installations in South Vietnam.
Most famously, the Viet Cong used an extensive tunnel system that extended for tens of thousands of miles and served as their base to engage in effective guerrilla tactics. They used these underground routes to house troops, transport communications and supplies, lay booby traps, and mount surprise attacks, after which they could disappear underground to safety. For the Americans and South Vietnamese, it was like they were fighting ghosts, and the Viet Cong was able to inflict heavy costs on them. In the face of this, the US deployed the longest and heaviest aerial bombardment in history by dropping over 7 million tons of explosives and killing over 3 million people. Their strategy was to cause so much death and destruction that people and the guerrillas would abandon their cause. But they never did. The US government constantly lied to the American public about the war and justified it by framing this as a fight against an immoral enemy. But as this became the world's first televised war, the horrific images from American massacres and the use of weapons like Agent Orange and napalm sparked outrage. This led to mass opposition to the war around the world and one of the largest protest movements in US history. After 20 years of fighting, the Vietnamese were able to liberate and unify their country and defeated a global superpower by maintaining the principles of guerrilla warfare. The conventional army couldn't win, and the guerrillas didn't lose. Does all of this sound familiar? Hamas believes it is fighting a just war for the liberation of Palestine against an adversary with superior military power. Hamas has relied on guerrilla warfare to ensure that it can survive and fight a protracted war on its own terms in terrain that is familiar to them. And just like the Viet Cong, an extensive tunnel system across Gaza gives Hamas protection, movement, and the ability to conduct hit-and-run operations against Israel's ground invasion. This is already leading to significant Israeli casualties and military losses. But this also means that Israel isn't able to achieve quick, decisive wins compared to its more conventional wars, especially as it has set its objective to eradicating Hamas, which in these circumstances is almost impossible. The longer Israel fights, the bigger impact it will have on its economy given the size of its army in proportion to the country's population. That is a high cost to live with over a long period of time. Secondly, Israel's unrelenting aerial bombardment of Gaza to establish deterrence by retribution and to have people turn on Hamas has caused mass death, destruction, and glaring war crimes, and is failing to crush people's appetite for liberation, sparking mass protests, solidarity, and pressure globally, which is starting to have an impact on domestic politics in the US. After weeks of bombardment and a ground invasion, Israel has yet to achieve its military objectives or release prisoners held by Hamas. Because remember, in guerrilla warfare, the conventional army loses if it does not win, and the guerrilla wins if he does not lose, and at this point, Israel is not winning and Hamas has not lost. In many ways, Hamas is replicating the Vietnamese experience, and to understand it, we must look to history, because it can shed light on the present and cut through the fog of war. My name is Salim, and I tell stories that connect the unexpected.